Chers étudiants et étudiantes, collègues et invités, c'est un véritable honneur et un privilège de vous présenter un Canadien renommé ce soir. I think you know who it is. A genetist by training, Dr. Suzuki is a household name. Thanks to his 30-year career in broadcasting on matters of nature and science, he has won 4 Gemini Awards. We're still working on our first one here. As best host of different Canadian television series, his 8-part television series, A Planet for the Taking, won an award from the United Nations. His 8-part BBC PBS series, The Secret of Life, was praised internationally, as was his 5-part series, The Brain, for the Discovery Channel. On June 10, 2002, he received the John Draney Award for Broadcasting Excellence. Dr. Suzuki est aussi reconnu comme un leader mondial dans l'écologie durable. Il a reçu le prix Challenger pour la science de l'UNESCO. He was the recipient of the United Nations Environmental Program Medal. Global 500 in 2009 won the Right Livelihood Award, and which is considered the alternative to the Nobel Prize. Mesdames et messieurs, without further delay, it was with great pleasure that I invite Dr. David Suzuki to our stage at the University of Ottawa ce soir. Thank you, sir.
J'habite à Vancouver, Colombie-Britannique, où nous ne parlons pas français. Le printemps dernier, je suis allé à Villefranche-sur-Mer pour 4 semaines pour apprendre la langue. Malheureusement, je ne suis pas bilingue. Et je parlerai en anglais. Excusez-moi. I'm delighted to be here. I thank Kevin very much when he emailed me and invited me. It is a great opportunity for me to spread the word, which is, for me, the most important election in my lifetime is coming up. And I must do everything I can to ensure that Mr. Harper does not get in again. Sorry. First, I would just want to remind you this was First Nations land, and when you think they inhabited this area for thousands of years, they sure did a better job of taking care of it than we have. I'm not here to speak on behalf of any group, any organization, any corporation or political party. I'm here this evening to speak to you as a grandfather. I'm the grandfather of 2 Haida grandsons who live on reserve with their mother and father. I'm also grandfather of a boy that is severely disabled with cerebral palsy. And I speak tonight as an elder. And elders, you know, have no hidden agenda. We're beyond worrying about money or power or celebrity. Well, there are a few elders that still do, but they need help. They got problems. Elders, as a rule, are beyond worrying about that, which means we don't have to play games. We don't have to kiss anybody's behind in order to get a promotion or a job or a raise. We can speak the truth from our hearts. And if that offends people, that's their problem, not ours. Harper's great success has been in uniting the right to vote as one bloc and provide him with a majority. And I think the challenge now is for those of us in the progressive side to follow a similar path. And that's why I've been spending the past couple of weeks working with Lead Now, a group that is trying to convince people to begin to vote strategically so that the progressive side isn't split and allow another government with a minority of votes. When whoever is elected in the election to come and whatever Parliament does will have very little consequence for me. I'm at the end of my life. But whoever is elected and whatever Parliament does or does not do will reverberate throughout your entire lives. You are the ones who have everything at stake in this election. You've got to get involved in the political process. One, you've got to get out and vote because you know your age group as disproportionately fails to vote. You cannot do that if you care about the future that you're going to. And if you're too young to vote, you've got two of the most important people on the planet who are going to be equal warriors on your behalf, and that's mom and dad. They have to be there to put your concerns onto the political agenda. And your grandmother and grandfathers, get them involved. You've got to be involved because we are at an absolutely critical moment, not just for our Canada, but for the entire planet. My grandparents emigrated to Canada from Japan between 1902 and 1904. My parents were born and raised in Canada. Dad was born in Vancouver in 1909, my mother in 1911. They couldn't vote until 1948 because they were Japanese. The First Nations of this country couldn't vote until 1960. So I've always taken my right to vote as a sacred duty. And I voted in every federal election since I turned 21 in 1957. I have never voted for a party that took power. It's not right, and I resent the fact that someone like Mr. Harper can get in with 39% of the vote. We desperately need to change our democratic system and abandon the first-past-the-post system. But we've got an election. We've got an election coming up on October 19th, and we can't wait for that. I have never given up in all of those years. I've never given up on this defective system because the opposition always had a role to play. The opposition had an opportunity to speak out. They had a right to demand information, to inspect it and speak out on behalf of those who didn't vote for the party in power. Mr. Harper has been convicted by the courts as being in what do you call it? Contempt of Parliament by denying what is the rightful demand of the opposition to have access for information. And he's doing it repeatedly, denying the opposition of that right. But the opposition's role is to examine information and claims and hold government accountable. When Mr. Harper prorogued Parliament to avoid being brought down or an embarrassment, I was absolutely stunned because that was not the kind of Parliament I thought we in Canada had. And when I heard of robocalls that were deliberately carried out in order to prevent certain groups of people from voting, I was outraged. But what outraged me more was that the leader of this country, the leader of the Prime Minister, didn't respond in outrage too, as this attack on democracy, and demand that the people who are carrying this out be brought out and brought to trial. Demand that this kind of activity cease. I was dumbfounded when Mr. Harper canceled the long-form census. I had always assumed that anyone claiming to govern a country would want the best information available to determine their policies and their activities. But then, in subsequent years, it became very clear when you don't have to deal with telling the truth or being consistent or having to deal with pesky facts, you can do anything you want. It's wonderful. You can say, before you get elected, the Senate needs to be reformed. And yet, once you get in, you can stack it with Harperites and get these unelected members to reject a bill that was passed by our elected Parliament to put Canada onto track to reach our climate change objectives. You can expand prisons at a time when crime rates are dropping. You can cancel the gun registry when law enforcement officials tell us it's effective and we need it. You can ignore calls from scientists to act on climate change. You can ignore economists who tell us that we have to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And you can take safe injection sites which have been shown to save lives and simply oppose them or refuse to support their establishment. That's the result of this government, which has tried to use every means it can to deny the public and our elected representatives the kind of information that impinges on the decisions and the acts, the programs that this government is carrying out. I lived in the United States from 1954 to 1962, getting an education that wasn't possible in Canada at that time. I was in my last year of college in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And it was a shock. And we realized that the Russians were very advanced in science, medicine, and technology. And the Americans began to throw money to develop their science capacity and to catch up. They established NASA in 1958. They began to support development of science departments in universities, support science students. Even though I was a foreigner living in the United States, it was great. You just had to say, oh yeah, I like science, and they threw money at you. It was a glorious time to be in the United States. And in 1962, I decided, nevertheless, that I wanted to come home. I wanted to come home to Canada. And I knew I was going to take a pay cut. I was, without even looking for jobs, I was offered a job at Stanford, at University of California at Davis, San Diego State. And I knew that I wouldn't get a large research grant in Canada. But I came home because to me, Canada was different. Not better, but different. And for me, those differences mattered. Canada was a peacekeeper, not a war maker. Canada was not driven in the way Americans are by the idea of money and the rugged individual carving a place out in the frontier. We're kind of civil servants, you know. Canada was a country in which the CCF was a respected party, not some kind of pinko commie organization. Canada was a place where a Tommy Douglas could become a Canadian hero, even though he never held power in government, where we had Medicare, where we had equalization payments, whereby the well-off provinces shared some of their good fortune with those who were less well-off. We had Quebec, we had the National Film Board and the CBC. Canada, to me, was a place where we measured our success, not by the number of obscenely wealthy people we had, but by the status of our poorest, our weakest, our most vulnerable in society. That was how we measure our success and progress. Those are the things that differentiated Canada from the United States, and I have never regretted coming home. But the last 10 years have been very trying in my life. When I came home, I was shocked, the first thing, as a scientist. I was a hotshot scientist, you know, I was going to make my name. And I was stunned at the puny research grants that we got in 1962. Ironically, parenthetically, what allowed me to carry out a scientific career is the Americans gave me a great big grant that I was allowed to keep in Canada. So they helped me stay in my country. But I was dismayed by the scientific illiteracy in Canada that was reflected in the political or politicians that we elect. You know, in all of the discussions that you've just heard over the past hour, I really believe we haven't confronted the fact that we don't take science seriously as a society. We have to take it as seriously as reading, writing, and arithmetic. It has to be a part of our culture. Way back in the 1970s, we carried out a survey of members of parliament at that time. And we found, not our surprise, that over 70% of politicians in 1970 came from two areas. They came from law and they came from business. So it's not an accident that we're very preoccupied with issues jurisdictional and economic. But then we gave a simple test on terms and concepts in science to those politicians. And business people and lawyers scored rock bottom. If they were in my genetics class, I'd have to have a special section for the very, very needy of information. I mean, they're totally illiterate, and yet they're going to make major decisions about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, space research, nanotechnology. You run down the list of big importance, and they're scientifically illiterate. It is absolutely appalling, this state. If we assess the importance of issues that confront us, you can do it very easily by looking at newspapers, measuring the amount of space devoted to different things, or watch the television news at night. If you did that, you'd very quickly find Canadians obviously are obsessed with politics, with business, with sports, and with celebrity. Everybody knows who Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian, even I know who the hell these people are, or Miley Cyrus or whatever. But you don't find any reflection of an understanding of the reality that the most powerful force shaping our lives in society today is science. Science when applied by industry, medicine, and the military. I was born in 1936, and when I was a child, my mother and dad wouldn't let me go to movies or public swimming pools in the summer because they were afraid I would catch polio. I wonder how many of you even know what polio is or does. When I was a child, hundreds of thousands of people died every year, and millions were horribly scarred by smallpox. Smallpox has been extinct for over 30 years. Mom and Dad wouldn't let me watch too much television or play video games or text message too much because there was no such thing when I was a child. There was no television. There were no computers or cell phones. There were no birth control pills. There were no genetic engineering or satellites. And I could give you a list that would run to pages of things that have come into being that have transformed the way we live. Those are the result of science and technology. In 1962, when I arrived back at the University of Alberta with my first job, I was asked to appear on, the university had a program on Sunday morning at 8:30 called Your University Speaks. And it was exactly what you'd expect. Serious professors in jacket and tie and telling us what the world was all about. And they asked me to do a show on genetics, and I did one. They loved it. I ended up doing 8. And what surprised me was that after a couple of shows, I started coming to campus, and people would say, "Hey, I saw that show you did. That was great." And I said, "What the hell are you doing watching television at 8:30 in the morning?" I was astounded that people were watching this medium that I had never grown up with. You see, when I went away to college in 1954, there was no television station in my hometown in London, Ontario. I didn't watch TV as a boy or even as a young adult. So I realized television was a powerful medium of communication. And that began, I didn't know it then, my career in television. You see, I believed, and I still believe, that we make the best decisions when we have the most and best information, the facts available to us. I realize now that it's far more complex than that. You know, it's our minds and our beliefs and value systems and all that shape the way we see our world. But I still believe that you have to have the best information you've got if you're going to make good or the best decisions. Mr. Harper has gone to incredible lengths to deny Canadians access to that information, and we've already heard a recitation of many of the things that are going on. But the thing that worries me is the way not only are we muzzling scientists, but we're vetting what information they have that gets out there, either in what pronouncements they make in public or the kind of publications that they have. He doesn't seem to realize that the minute you do that, it invalidates the science as being credible. Science doesn't operate that way. You don't fit it through ideological or political lenses in order to shape the science. He disqualifies government science the minute he imposes that kind of restriction on what gets out. When you no longer use science as one of the important inputs in decisions you make, then where do you turn to? Do we go to the Fraser Institute? Do we go to the Bible? Do we go to the Quran? Anything goes now because we're not running on anything rational or logical. It's now ideological. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher was filmed picking up litter in London, and she turned to camera and said, "I'm a greenie too." That's because in 1988, the environment had reached the top around the world as a public concern. In 1988, a guy ran for president of the United States and said, "If you vote for me, I will be an environmental president." His name was George H.W. Bush. He didn't have a green bone in his body, but he said it because Americans made him say it. They had put it at the top of the agenda. In 1988, Brian Mulroney was reelected, and to show he cared about the environment, he appointed his brightest star to be the Minister of the Environment. Anyone know who that was? Lucien Bouchard. 4 months after he was appointed, I interviewed him, and I said, "Mr. Bouchard, what have you found is the most important environmental issue confronting Canadians today?" And he immediately said, "Global warming." That was impressive. 1988. So I said, "How serious is it?" And these are his exact words. "It threatens the survival of our species. We must act now." 1988. 1988, Stephen Lewis told me he chaired some of the sessions at a climatology meeting at the University of Toronto, and there were 300 climatologists from around the world. They were convinced the evidence was in human use of fossil fuels was causing climate change or global warming. And at the end of the conference, they released a press release that said, "Global warming represents a threat to human survival, second only to nuclear war." And they called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. Think if we had done it. If we took the science and scientists seriously, we would be way past the Kyoto target. We would have saved tens of billions of dollars and would be well on our way to a fossil fuel-free future. But we didn't. I won't go into why we didn't, but we simply didn't take the science seriously. Canada, of all of the industrialized countries, is probably more vulnerable to climate change than any of the others. We are a northern country, and we know the warming is going on at a greater rate in the polar areas. And for over 40 years, the Inuit have been telling us something is happening. Something's happening to the ice. The winters aren't as cold as they're used to. We know that the warming in the north is happening, and it's happening at over twice the rate as it is in the southern parts of Canada. We have the longest marine coastline of any country in the world. One of the properties of water is when it gets warm, it expands. Sea level rise through thermal expansion alone will affect Canada more than any other nation. And when we look at the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, when they begin to slide into the oceans, sea levels will rise by tens of meters. Canada has the most at stake in this. And then you think of all of the climate-affected economic areas of Canadian society: agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, winter sports. The economic consequences of what we know is happening are going to hit Canada very, very heavily. For 10 years, Mr. Harper has been saying that doing anything about climate change will destroy the economy. I believe, if you're the CEO of a corporation and you deliberately ignore or deny information relevant to your carrying out your job, you can be thrown in the slammer for willful blindness. And I certainly believe that Harper has been willfully blind of what the scientific community has been saying. This is more than just a minor crime. It is an intergenerational crime. in the sake of his political agenda, he is leaving to you the consequences of being willfully blind and denying the need to act. Now, he hasn't listened to me. He hasn't given me an opportunity. But that's because when he was the leader of the Reform Party, I happened to be in Parliament when he was being interviewed, so I stood around and listened, and this is way back over 10 years ago, and the interviewer said, well, what do you think about doing something about global warming? And Mr. Harper said, well, that's crazy. It'll destroy the economy. And when he was finished, I went up to him and I said, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. But to his credit, he's been consistent all the way along. He says it's crazy economics. He destroyed Mr. Dion for proposing a carbon tax, saying that this is it's totally crazy, it'll destroy the economy. But what about the facts? What about Sweden? Northern country like Canada, 1991 imposed a carbon tax of $133 a ton. BC's carbon tax, which is touted as this great thing, is $30 a ton. Sweden, $133, which a few years ago was raised to $167 or $169. Holy cow, Sweden must be an economic basket case. Well, guess what? They reduced their greenhouse gas emissions between 1991 and 2008 by 40%. Carbon tax works. But in that period, their economy grew by 44%. So what the hell kind of a leader who says economics is his area will willfully ignore the implications of climate change and then pronounce as an economic leader that it'll destroy the economy to take action on it? This is intergenerational crime. And look, he has always said, well, we can't do anything when the biggest polluter is the United States. Well, look at Mr. Obama, who recently went up north of the Arctic Circle. He went to the oil state of Alaska, and he told Alaskans, we have to reduce emissions. That's all there is to it. And Mr. Harper, he went up there last month, remember, 5 days in the Arctic, never once mentioned the words climate change. The Harper government says that the economy is everything, and apparently from the last debate, the other leaders agree with him as well. We didn't have Elizabeth there, so we couldn't get her take on that. So the other, oh yeah, me too, the economy. Wait a minute now. His agenda is that he wants to fuel our economy by making Canada a petro superpower, a superpower in oil. Any economist will tell you, putting all of your emphasis on one industry or one area is very, very dangerous. If that area suffers any kind of upset, well, guess what? You suffer disproportionately because it's so much a part of your economy. Look at Alberta, for God's sakes. And now Mr. Harper's blaming the NDP for the mess that they're in. It's putting all your eggs in one basket. I can take you to British Columbia and show you dozens of ghost towns, shadows of what once were, because those communities put all their eggs in fishing, or all their eggs in logging, or all of their eggs in mining. And when conditions change, guess what? You're in deep trouble. Anyone who cares about the economy should be looking at a diverse economy where you have many, many different inputs from many sectors. That's the most resilient kind of economy. And I'm not even in the economy, for God's sake. But that is the most resilient economy you can have. We are at a point now, though, because of Mr. Harper's willful blindness, his refusal to even engage on the issue of climate. You know, we've had what? How many weeks now of campaigning? Have you heard Mr. Harper talk at all about climate change or even a bigger issue, the environment? Scientists now tell us that the opportunity to be able to recover the productivity, the abundance on the planet is gone, that we've passed too many tipping points to go back to what once was. There are many of my peer group who are saying it's too late. And to them I say, look, say that it's urgent, it's very, very late, then please shut up. Don't say it's too late, because we're going to fight to the end anyway. There's no point in saying it's too late. But it is very, very late to be able to take the big steps. It's no longer about putting a Band-Aid here and a little change there. We need some big changes, like a commitment to getting off fossil fuels in something like 10 years, not 2050 or 2100. We need some big decisions. If we look at the trajectory of emissions over the past 40 years, it leads you to feel very, very pessimistic. We have really done nothing to curb the kind of the emissions that we've been emitting. But the very crisis, the urgency of what we confront today is a huge opportunity. We can't piddle around with a little this and a little that. We need big change. This is the golden opportunity to get things right. That's what I hope some of you have seen, the LEAP manifesto that Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis have put out now, and marshaled a huge amount of support from many, many areas. This is the opportunity to get the issues of energy, of sustainability, of communities, of First Nations, unemployment, equitable jobs, equitable economies. A whole bunch of issues can now be brought to bear at this moment of crisis that is our opportunity to move in a different direction. We, ever since Rachel Carson, who published Silent Spring in 1962, I've been involved in battles of what we now call the environmental movement. In British Columbia, we fought against clear-cut logging, against large dams, against oil supertankers coming along our coast, against toxic pollution. And these battles continue to this day. But for several years now, I've said, I don't want to fight anymore. When we have fights, there's a winner and a loser, and we can't afford to have losers. We're talking about the future for our children and grandchildren. We can't have losers. So I believe that we have to stop fighting for our little cut of the pie or our vested interest and come together as a species and agree on what our foundation is of the way we live. So I got a call a few years ago from the CEO of one of the largest companies in the tar sands. And he said, would it be okay if I came down to talk to you? I said, I'm honored, I'm thrilled, of course. Come and talk to me. So he came down the next day, and when he came to my door, I said, thank you for coming. I feel privileged that you've taken the time. But before you come through the door, I'm asking you, leave your identity as a CEO of this oil company outside the door. I want to meet you as a human to human, man to man. Well, I could see immediately he was not very happy because he had come down for a very different reason. So I took him to my office and I said, look, what I want to say is that the reality of the way that we live, and surely you have to agree with this, the reality is we live in a world that is shaped and constrained by laws of nature. And there's nothing we can do about those laws. So in physics, we know we can't build a rocket that will go faster than the speed of light. We know that. We can't build an anti-gravity machine on Earth. We can't build a perpetual motion machine. These things are dictated to us by physics, and everybody accepts that's the way the planet is. In chemistry, it's the same thing. The atomic properties of the elements, diffusion constants, reaction rates, these are all factors that determine the kind of atoms that you can take and put together and the kind of molecules you can synthesize and how long it will take. All that stuff is dictated to us by laws of chemistry. And in biology, it's exactly the same thing. Every species has a maximum number that can live in an ecosystem or a habitat that's dictated by the carrying capacity of that ecosystem or that habitat. Exceed that limit and your population will crash. And humans are no different. Although we're not confined to an ecosystem or a habitat, our home, in fact, is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. That's our domain. That's our house. And there are limits on how many human beings can be carried. Most of us feel that we're far above the ability of the planet, of the biosphere, to sustain 7 billion people. But, and you can say, well, how can we all live and keep adding more? We do it by using up the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. That's how we sustain the illusion that everything's okay and we can go on as we do. So there's carrying capacity of the planet dictates that we as well will be limited or confined by, to a number that can be carried indefinitely. But the other reality is that we are animals. And I'm amazed at the number of people that get really angry when I say that. I was in Texas, and Austin, Texas, and there were a lot of children in the audience, and I said, now kids, if you remember one thing from my speech, remember we are animals. My God, this woman was so pissed off, she came up and said, don't you call my daughter an animal, we're human beings. And I just looked at her, I said, if you're not an animal, are you a plant? Like, we are animals, and our biological nature dictates certain fundamental realities. I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have a breath of air for 3 to 4 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So would you not agree with me that clean air has got to be the highest priority for us to protect? He kind of went, he didn't agree with me. And then I said, look, Mr. CEO, you're 60 to 70% water by weight. We're all basically a big blob of water with enough thickener added, we don't dribble away on the floor. But you know, the water leaks out of our bodies through our skin and our eyes and our crotch and our mouth, and so we have to keep topping up. I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have water for 3 to 4 days, you're dead. If you have to drink contaminated water, you're sick. So can we put clean water up there with clean air as the highest priority of all human beings on the planet? And then I said, if you don't have food for 4 to 6 weeks, you're dead. If you have polluted food, you're sick. So can we put food, which most comes from the soil, food and soil, up there with clean air and clean water? And then I said, all of the energy in your body and mine, all of that energy, and the energy in the fossil fuel industry and in the wood, all of the energy that we use is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis. We then eat the plants or eat the animals that eat the plants, store that energy in our bodies, and when we want to move, grow, reproduce, we burn those molecules and release the energy of the sun back out into our bodies. So I said, Mr. CEO, photosynthesis has got to be up there. I said, these are the foundation of the way we have to live. And guess what? This is what indigenous people around the world have been telling us for years. They call the earth our mother because we are created by the 4 sacred elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And the miracle of life on this planet is that the 4 sacred elements are cleansed, replenished, created by the web of living things. It's all of the plants that take carbon out of the air, put oxygen back in it. It's the plants and soil fungi that filter water as it percolates through the soil. It's plants and animals that create the soil to grow our food. And it's all of the plants in the oceans and on land that photosynthesize. So to me, it's crystal clear, and I ask you, Mr. CEO, please, we have to establish the foundation of the way that we live and are healthy and well off. Protect the clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean energy, and biodiversity. Well, he couldn't agree in the end. And in a way, it was very, very unfair. You see, he hadn't come down to talk to me as a human being to a human being. He had come down as the CEO of a big oil company. He couldn't go back to his shareholders and say, gee, I listened to Suzuki and we've got to stop doing what we do because it screws up the air, the water, the soil. He'd be fired in a flash. And so until we can, you know, in December of this year is the 21st meeting to deal with climate change, COP21. the French ambassador came to my office and I said, look, this has got no chance if you're not going to say, we've had 20 meetings, it doesn't work. We got to do something different. Can we not have a meeting where all of the delegates there agree that these things are the foundation of a happy, healthy life? And then we'll ask, how do we manage our emissions? How do we create an economy? How do corporations exist? That's the only way, it seems to me, we can get out of the mess. So to me, these are the fundamental ways we have to live that are dictated by the laws of nature. Other things, borders we draw around property, our cities, our provinces, our country, those are not forces of nature. We dictate those. Nature couldn't care less about our boundaries. And yet we try to manage nature through these borders that we draw. Ask a monarch butterfly who they belong to. Ask a salmon that is born in a Canadian river, goes out through Alaska, along the coast of Russia and Japan, who they belong to. Ask birds that migrate from South America to the Arctic, who they don't belong to anyone. They are a part of nature, and we try to manage them through our jurisdictions that we draw that don't make any sense. And then we create things like capitalism, like the economy, like markets, like corporations. I was amazed, I have a lot of time for Preston Manning, but the minute you say, well, markets, he goes, markets, praise the markets, well, let the market do its thing, hallelujah. The market, for Christ's sake, we invented it. It's not a force of nature. We can't change nature, but we can change the things that we invent. And that's the problem, is that we're now asking nature to fit our agenda. We're constantly trying to shoehorn nature. We're going to go to Paris in December, 195 countries, trying to deal with the atmosphere that belongs to no one through the lenses of 192 national borders and 195 national economies. How the hell are we ever going to do something that makes any sense? I don't think anyone knows what the solution to the problems we face now will be. But I'd like to end just on a story. As I said, I was in my last year in college in 1957. And October 4th, 1957, not any of the old folks here, any of the young people know what October 4th, 1957 was? Okay. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. I already told you that. But that was October 4th. And we were astonished. This was at the height of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union looked really powerful. And the Americans immediately cranked up their rockets. They had an Army, Navy, and Air Force rockets. And they wanted to match, and every one of them blew up on the launch pad. It was a really frightening time. Meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal in space, a dog, Laika. The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. The first team of cosmonauts. The first spacewalk. The first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. Americans didn't roll over and say, oh, hell, they're way too advanced. We can't afford that. We're not going to catch up. They said, we've got no choice. We got to catch up to these guys. And in 1961, President Kennedy said, we are going to get a man to the moon and back in this decade. And they did it in less than a decade. It was an amazing achievement. And that was an amazing achievement. But at the beginning of the space race, Americans didn't have a clue how the hell they were going to get out of the problem of being so far behind. They didn't have a clue. All they did was say, we've got to catch up. And they threw money at it. They hired the best scientists they could. And they are the only country to land people on the moon and bring them back. But think of the other things. Over 50 years later, every time the Nobel Prizes in science are announced, guess who gets a lot of them, if not most of them? Americans. Because in 1957, they said, we got to catch up and we got to build our scientific capacity. And then think of all the unexpected benefits that came out of the space race. GPS, laptops, ear thermometers, corneal implants. I mean, the list. NASA publishes a magazine every year of dozens, and I think it's called Spin-Off, dozens and dozens of magazines that have spun off as a result of the space race. You just make the commitment and all of these other possibilities arise. And I tell Americans when I'm down there, it's un-American to say we can't do anything about climate change. It's going to cost too much. That's not the American way. Make the commitment and all of the other benefits, I guarantee, history informs us, all kinds of benefits will fall out. The important challenge is to make the commitment. And that's what's going to happen at this election. We have to make sure that we do not elect a Harper government so that Canada can make its commitment and do its part in the future that's coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Suzuki. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for educating us about the commitments that we've got to make. And, you know, a few weeks ago, we were thinking about holding this event, and you know, events on science and other issues. And we were around with a few people around a table, and we said, like, who's the person we need to get that would inspire us, that would give us passion, that would, you know, help explain, as one person said, like, why this science needs to be a kitchen table, you know, kind of discussion. And like the first name that came up was Dr. Suzuki, and then a few minutes later was an email. A few minutes after that, I'm coming. How good was that?
It's because of you, you know.
And when I talked to Dr. Suzuki, he said, I'm in, I'm coming. He said, I want to come. I want to speak to the next generation. I want to be there. And it was so when he talked about intergeneration, his commitment is 100% there. Notre symposium et allocution ce soir ont encouragé notre réflexion sur les questions importantes pour le futur du Canada. Cet événement fait partie d'une série de conférences qui sont financées par une subvention du Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines. So these research grants are important. They could even bring people like Dr. Suzuki here. All he wanted was a plane ticket and a bed to sleep on tonight. That's what he came on. So I'd like to thank our panelists who are sitting right here, for their participation in helping us underscore the importance of evidence with public policy and political decision-making. So this week we have more events. This was a major day for us, but tomorrow we talk about the economy. There'll be great economists on this panel, and after that, Mr. Mulcair is going to do a keynote speech on the economy. And then on the following day, on Wednesday, we're going to have a panel on healthcare, the future of healthcare system, not just for my generation, but for your generation. And at the keynote is going to be Roy Romano, who knows a little bit about healthcare. He did the Royal Commission a little over 10 years ago. Nous remercions notre doyen, Marcel Moret, et nos collègues à la Faculté des sciences sociales, en particulier notre équipe de communication et de marketing, Bridget Genier, Saint-Jean, Marianne Burgess, and Natalie Semur. Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Bridget. We would like to thank our University of Ottawa President, Alan Rock, and his team for their ongoing support and encouragement. We want to thank CPAC for our policy conference series, Kevin Chan and Mark Disnell for our partners at Facebook, and to the students and young alumni, and iVote-jeVote. And when Dr. Suzuki heard about that, he was overwhelmed. He had to be here. Vous êtes le futur de ce pays et notre ensemble fier. Your talents and efforts are awesome and inspiring, and we thank you for your dedication to youth engagement. This is an event, and all these events are moved by students. Merci à tous et toutes pour votre participation ce soir. We look forward to seeing you at the University of Ottawa tomorrow and Wednesday for more discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.